If you got your Bibles with you, we're going to be in Genesis 46 and 47 this morning. As I said, this text this morning is a beautiful example of how God fulfills his promise. Way back in Genesis 15, when God was calling Abram as the first man of this new family, this new people of God. God called Abram and he said to him this. He said, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years." These are not the kind of promises that we want to hear from God. We want the happy blessing type of promises, but God deals with reality, and that there's such a reality that God's ways are not our ways and God's thoughts are not our thoughts. And so he calls Abram, and he calls him to bless him. He calls him to be a blessing. He promises to be with him and to be for him. He gives him the promise that through him all the nations of the earth will be blessed, but it's not a straightforward path. It's not an easy journey. It's not the blessing of comfort and convenience. And so here later, God calls to Abram. He says, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to use you. Through you will come the Messiah. Everybody's going to be ultimately blessed in you, but it's not going to be an easy journey. And so he says, you're going to have many offspring, and you remember the story. Abram and Sarai were infertile. They were unable to conceive. This was the greatest desire of their heart and their greatest fear and frustration in life. They could not conceive. But God came and said, no, you're going to have a child. You're going to have offspring. And in fact, your offspring is going to become a nation and a nation of nations. And, remember the story. I mean, they tried to help God out, right? That didn't work out so well. They did all sorts of stuff. But God, even in spite of their failure of faith, God keeps coming back and says, no, I promise this is going to happen. It's going to happen. And it happened. Abraham and Sarah had Isaac. They had the child of promise. It wasn't easy. It wasn't straightforward, but it happened. But God gives this promise in Genesis 15. He says, you need to know this. You're going to have offspring, but they're gonna spend some time out of the land that I promised you. They're going to be in a foreign land, and they're going to suffer affliction, not for a day or a week or a year, for generations, for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. So we already see here in this couple of verses, God has a different sense of time and a different sense of purpose than we do. In other words, though we're tempted, and I mean really tempted every day, to judge what is happening by what we can see, there's always something more going on. Look, for 400 years, the descendants of Abraham are going to be afflicted in a foreign nation. It's going to look like the promises of God aren't being fulfilled. So, I mean, you've got generations of kids that are going to be born in a foreign land. The land is Egypt. They're going to be born there. They never know the land. They've never experienced it. All they've experienced is going to be slavery. That's all they know. And so their entire lives, from their birth till their death, because for 400 years, you're going to have a couple of generations that are going to live and die in that experience. And so their entire experience is going to be, wow, doesn't look like God is going to fulfill his promises, but God always fulfills his promises. So for 400 years they will be there, but I will bring judgment, and they will come out with great possessions. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and You will be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete," which is a crazy phrase that I don't have time to go into, but here's what we want to take from this. We're tempted because of our inherent self-centeredness and narcissism to embrace the idea that everything is about us. You do that, right? Like, I know you do it, but I'd be really happy if you'd admit it and own it this morning with me. Like that, we do that. That's just part of what it means to be human. So we interpret all of the events, and we take everything personally. And the reality is, man, I so love to break this to you this morning. It's not about you. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't love you. That doesn't mean that God doesn't care for you. We're going to see actually the opposite is true. That we serve a God who is able to treasure you and love you and value you and have purpose for you as an individual and still be working on bigger stuff at the same time. And he never promises that we'll understand what's going on. That's Genesis 15. You're going to go away, and it's going to be for a long time, but I'm going to bring you back. So let's look at it. It says this: Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. So Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brothers. He'd spent a couple of decades there. God had elevated him to a place of unbelievable power so that he might preserve the life, not only of his family, but of all the nations around. Joseph's brothers come begging for grain. They end up with Joseph. They don't know it's him. It gets messy for a while. But last week, we see this great reveal of Joseph to his brothers, and they're not only reunited, but they're reconciled. The family is restored. Forgiveness and grace wins the day. And Joseph and his brothers are back together. And all Joseph wants is to have his dad with him. So he and Pharaoh as well send the brothers back to the land of Canaan to get Jacob, Israel, and bring him to Egypt. So he took his journey and he came to Beersheba. And we've seen Beersheba a lot in the book of Genesis. When Abram came into the land, and because God called him out of his father's house and out of the father's land, he came into the land and he spent some time at Beersheba. In fact, he bought a plot there. He dug a well. He built the first altar there to worship God. When Abraham was tested and tried by God to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice and took him up on Mount Moriah, when they came down afterwards, after God delivered Isaac, after God offered a substitute, they came down to Beersheba. They built an altar and they worshiped God. It's about a 25-mile journey from where Jacob was. Not an easy journey at his age, but Pharaoh had sent carts. They packed up everything they had and they go. And I just think it's beautiful that a father on his way to see his son pauses to worship the God of his father, Isaac. At the place where his grandfather and his father had come and worshiped the Lord as he's journeying out of the land of promise, but still under the promise of God, he stops and he worships. God spoke to Israel visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob," and he said, "Here I am." We're always looking for themes and repetition in the scriptures. We've seen this before when God came to Abram in the visions of the night. "Abraham, Abraham," what did he say? "Here I am." Now God comes and says, "Jacob, Jacob, here I am." We get to the next book in the Torah, Exodus, and the opening chapters, chapter 3. God comes and he calls to Moses. Moses, Moses, what does he say? Here I am. He said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. There's a lot of reasons he could have been afraid to go to Egypt. In fact, God had specifically told his father, Isaac, not to go to Egypt when there had been another famine in the land. And so God's done so much to bring Abram and his family into the land. The idea of leaving the land must have felt heretical. It must have felt so wrong. God, after everything you've done to place us here, now you want to take us out? After you kept telling us, you told my dad over and over again, don't leave, don't go to Egypt, now you want me to go to Egypt? But God comes to him and he says, don't be afraid, for there I will make you into a great nation. I don't think for a second that Jacob understood why God was doing this. I think there's a very clear reason, and we're going to see it in a minute, why God is going to do this. But he calls him, he says, don't be afraid, trust me, I'm going to make you in a great nation. I'm not going to do it here, I'm going to do it there. I myself will go down with you to Egypt. I'm not going to leave you for a second. I'm going to be with you every step of the way. And I will also bring you up again. And then this last phrase, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. When you die, the son that you've loved and treasured will be there with you. He will be the one that closes your eyes. Something so profound about that. I think we see what I've already stated this morning, this incredible juxtaposition. One, God's plans are always bigger than you. And two, God loves you and has plans for you in that. Don't be afraid. Go down. I'm doing something that's bigger than you that you can't quite understand right now. So just go and trust me. And at the same time, I see you, Jacob. I know the desire of your heart. I know how you've grieved inconsolably for your son, Joseph. But I've protected him and I've preserved him, and you're going to be together. And when you die, he will be there with you. So Jacob sent out from Beersheba. The sons of Israel carried Jacob, their father, their little ones, and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They took their livestock and their goods which they had gained in the land of Canaan and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his offspring with him, his sons and his sons' sons, and with him his daughters and his sons' daughters. All his offspring he brought with him into Egypt. And now we get to the most exciting part of any Bible study, a genealogy. Man, I remember as a kid, I just hated reading these genealogies. Like, why? It really struck me this week. What is really important in life? At the end of the day, what's really important? You know, for the ancient Israelites, what was really important is the same thing for us. It was the people that they loved. It was their family. It was relationship. It should be no surprise. Like when we really think about it in that way, if we're sitting down to chronicle how God has been working and what God has been doing, what are you going to write about? You're going to write about that which is of utmost importance to you, that which you treasure the most. And for the ancient Israelites, for the people and descendants of Abram, that was their family. And so it's really no surprise to me now when I keep coming across genealogy after genealogy after genealogy, because they're recording in history that which was of utmost importance to them. It wasn't very thoughtful, though, because their names are really difficult to pronounce. So I'm not even going to try some of these, all right? We're going to we're going to walk through it real quick, and then I'm going to point out a couple of things. So these are the names of the descendants of Israel who came into Egypt: Jacob and his sons. Reuben, Jacob's firstborn. And the sons of Reuben were those guys. And then there were the sons of Simeon, and you can read those names to yourself. And then there are the sons of Levi, and then the sons of Judah. And it's interesting because two of the sons of Judah that we already encountered in that terrible chapter, 38, they've already died, but they still get listed. That's why some of the numbers get weird here later. And the sons of Issachar, and the sons of Zebulon. These are the sons of Leah. So there's an order and an organization to this genealogy. You remember that Isaac fell in love with Rachel, wanted to marry Rachel. Laban tricked him. He married Leah first. Then he had to work for another 7 years. Then he married Rachel. Then they were having fertility issues. So then he took the 2 maidservants. So he ends up with 4 wives and a lot of kids, 12, right? And so it starts with the descendants of Leah, and their number is 33. And then we get the sons of Gad. There they are. And the sons of Asher, and the sons of Zilpah. They number up to 16. Okay, so that's the handmaid of Leah. So Leah has 33. Zilpah has 16. Then there's sons of Rachel, Jacob's wife, Joseph and Benjamin. And to Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim. We saw that. And the sons of Benjamin. Now, Benjamin he's still a young teen at this point when they're actually going, right? So these sons are listed, but he hasn't had them yet. But that's okay. Because they're writing about what's important to them, right? So these are the sons of Rachel, 14 persons in all. And then we get the son of Dan, the sons of Naphtali, and those are the sons of Bilhah, Rachel's servant, whom Laban had given to Rachel's daughter, and she had 7 persons in all. So there's some interesting, numbers are always interesting in the book of Genesis. And remember, they don't use numbers the way that we do, right? Because their culture was different than ours. They're using numbers symbolically and typologically. They're making statements about it. It's a fascinating reality. Like, so Leah has 33. Her maidservant has 16. Half, off by 1. Rachel has 14. Her maidservant has 7. It's half. There's the number 7 gets worked into here in multiple ways, okay? So we get here, all the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. So the math gets weird because some of the kids hadn't been born and some of them died, and Joseph's already in Egypt, and there's all this sort of stuff going on. And so it says, all the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70. Right, 70 people. Leah's side totals 49. Rachel's side, 21. 7 times 7, 7 times 3. 49, 21 equals 70, right? This is, where else have we seen the number 70? We saw it in the Table of Nations, Genesis chapter 10, right? The Tower of Babel. God disperses the people. He gives the Table of Nations. How many nations were there? There were 70 nations, right? So what's happening here, there's so many strands that are being pulled together in this story. God disperses mankind. Mankind builds the tower and says, God, we don't really want you to control us. We want to control you. We don't want to be under you. We want to be over you. We want you to do what we want you to do, how we want to do it in our own way. And God says, well, if that's what you want, I'll kind of give it to you. So you're not going to be my people anymore. And he disperses them. He puts them underneath the divine counsel. And then he makes for himself a new people, Abram. So we have this reality in Genesis that the people have been dispersed. They've rejected God, and God's given them what they've asked. You don't want me to be your God. I will step away from you. And the 70 nations are dispersed. But then God says, but I'm not giving up. So I'm going to make my own people. I'm going to make a new people. So he chooses Abram, and he makes him into a people. And now, as this people is going off into Egypt, where God is going to make them into the nation and fulfill his promises, now we got 70 people going out. And so what we see is that Israel is functioning as a microcosm of all people. That's how God is going to bring reconciliation and restoration to the world. He's going to do it through one people, but he's not just doing it for that people. He's doing it for all the peoples. It's so beautiful to me. These simple little details. Now, he sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to show the way before him in Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. Then Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel his father in Goshen. He presented himself to him. What a moment. My wife's been asking me for like the last 4 weeks, when do they get back together? This is it, babe. Israel his father in Goshen, he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. I think that's crazy understatement. I think that's ugly crying. Like just snot bubble, uncontrollable, holding on to each other. Like, I can't believe it. They hold each other. What a moment. Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you're still alive. Yes. So Joseph says to his brother, he gathers everybody, his brothers and his father's household, and he says, I'm going to go up and tell Pharaoh, and I will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they've been keepers of livestock, and they've brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. Now, I mentioned last week that the Egyptians looked down upon shepherds. Anybody that dealt with livestock, and they found that, I think the technical word is icky. They despised. They were shepherds and herdsmen, people that dealt with animals and livestock, were marginalized peoples. They were looked down upon. They were lower rung people. So Joseph's like, I'm going to go to Pharaoh, and I'm going to tell him that y'all are shepherds. And more than that, he says, when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So he gathers his brothers and say, I'm going to bring you before Pharaoh, and when you go meet Pharaoh, tell him you're the thing that he despises. And they're like, I thought you forgave us, Joseph. There's such a deep wisdom here. So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, my father and my brothers, with their flocks and herds and all that they possess, have come from the land of Canaan. They're now in the land of Goshen. And from among his brothers, he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were. So, we're not just bad, we come from a bad lineage. Like that, and frankly, this is all we know. Because when he says, what's your occupation, what is he saying? What use are you? What do you bring with you? What are you going to contribute to my kingdom and my culture and my society? And they're like, we play with sheep, and that's all we know how to do. They said to Pharaoh, we've come to sojourn in the land, for there's no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. So now, if you remember, Pharaoh had already said, you can come and you can live in Goshen. I've given you this. So this is a formality of sorts, but that it's the formality of relationship. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. This is a celebratory statement because Pharaoh loves Joseph because Joseph has saved him and his kingdom. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. Because we don't like dealing with livestock, but we sure like to eat it. So now that you're here, you guys can have the really good pasture land, and maybe you can help take care of some of my livestock, but just stay there. Just stay there. So Joseph brought in Jacob, his father, and stood him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh, which is an upside-down reality. Pharaoh is above Jacob, but actually Jacob is above Pharaoh. So Jacob comes in and blesses Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many are the days of the years of your life? Which is a really nice way of saying, you look old. How old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. And then Jacob says, few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning. We can say Jacob's a glass half empty kind of guy, but he's not wrong. Like, his days have been hard. Now, a lot of it he brought upon himself. But he spent most of his life running away from his brother. God did reconcile that. He spent most of his life dealing with the dysfunction of the family that he created. Like, his life was not easy. His life was not simple. And this is Israel. Jacob, the striver, becomes Israel, the one who strove with God and lived. This is the one that God has chosen. This is God's covenant son of promise. His life was hard. He's honest about it. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt and the best of the land in the land of Ramses, and just as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents. So why would God spend so many years with Abram and Isaac and Jacob, getting them into the land and watching over them and working through them, only to take them out of the land? Why would God work in such a way? Why would Jacob take his brothers before Pharaoh and tell him, say, hey, you're the worst of the worst of the worst? And so Pharaoh loves Joseph and wants to bless him, but he's like, okay, take your people over there and do that livestock thing over there. And that's exactly what happens. And I don't think they had a clue. I think Joseph had some wisdom and understanding in this. God needed to develop this family into a nation. And that was not going well in the land of Canaan. Because in the land of Canaan, they were so similar, they shared so much culture with the other Canaanite peoples, that their hearts were constantly being turned away from God to the gods of the Canaanites. They were marrying into other families and being lured towards their gods. We've seen it We saw it with Judah. We've seen it in all of their families. This has been a reality. In the land of Canaan are all these other Canaanite people that, if you remember what God said in Genesis 15, the sin of the Amorites is it's not quite done yet. God needs to get his people away from those peoples and give them time and space to grow into the nation that he's promised they would become. So he takes them out of the land where their hearts were constantly being led astray, takes them into the land of Egypt where they're going to be forced into kind of a segregation reality. The Egyptians are going to look down on them because they're shepherds and herdsmen, which is going to allow them to grow as a people into a nation that they're not going to be drawn to the gods of Egypt. They're going to be despised by the Egyptians. There's if you're in the middle of it and you're stuck under your subjective experience, you can't see the divine wisdom of God's plan. But we have the benefit, and this is why the scriptures were written for us, to step back and look and go, man, what God is doing here, taking them out of land into the land of Egypt for 400 years, and it's not going to be easy, and it's going to look in all sorts of way like everything is out of control and all is lost. But at the end of the day, God is on his throne, and it's all happening according to his plan and purpose. And that's an amazing reality. That's a gift for us to be able to look back at Genesis and say, man, what these guys went through was crazy. And it looked like God was out of control, but he was actually really in control. Because I don't know if you look around and think things are crazy. If you don't, I don't know that you're looking around. It's crazy. And it's not hard. It's not hard on a day like today for our spiritual family to feel like God's not in control, to feel like things are spinning out of control and it's not going the way that it's supposed to. And it's because our ways are not his ways and our thoughts are not his thoughts. And life is way more complex, and God's plans are much more long-term and much greater and bigger than just us. And yet he still loves us in the mix of all that. And in the end, God always keeps his promises. So even when it doesn't look, when it doesn't feel, when it doesn't in any way, shape, or form look like God is doing what's best or what's right or what's good, we get the beauty of hindsight, at least in these stories, to look back and say, man, they must have felt that way all the time. And yet God was good. You know, one of the things that I've been doing the last few weeks is showing you how Joseph is a type of Jesus, the Messiah. There's so many ways that Joseph points forward to the one who is going to come to bring the blessing to all the nations. In Matthew chapter 2, opening of Matthew's gospel describing the birth of Jesus, the miraculous, supernatural birth. And yeah, it was heralded by angels and shepherds and gifts and all of this amazing stuff. And in the midst of it, we have Herod launching genocide, killing thousands of young male children because he perceived that a threat to his ruling has come. And so we find this, it says, when they had departed, so Joseph and Mary take their son And it says, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. I don't think it's a mistake that the guy that God chose to be Jesus's father was named Joseph. And when Jesus was born, the first thing that has to happen is that Joseph has to take the family to Egypt to protect them. So stay there, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This is to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, there's a lot theologically going on there. It's a quote from Hosea chapter 11, and the concept is that Israel as a whole is God's son. But they've been a terrible son. They've rebelled against the father. They've gone after other fathers. They haven't done the duties and responsibilities and privileges of a good son. And so when Jesus comes, he comes as the true son of Israel, son as Israel. Out of Egypt I called my son. God called 400 years later, after Israel's family goes, God calls them, and Moses brings them out. He brings them out of Egypt to be his people and bring his blessing. And man, it doesn't go well. Look, it's an amazing story, right? The Exodus, the deliverance. God brings them out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, showers his blessings upon them. They get to a mountain. Moses goes up onto the top, and they're like, oh, I guess we lost Moses. Let's make a golden calf. And that's just the beginning. God fulfills his promise, and they grumble. They long to go back to slavery in Egypt because there were leeks there. I still don't know what a leek is, for sure. I just don't. But they really missed them. So they wander around for 40 years in the desert. God provides for them. It's amazing. Finally brings them into the land. He delivers them. He uses them as an instrument of judgment against the Amorites, just as he said he would. And all this stuff happens, but they constantly rebel. So God sends Jesus, son of Abraham, son of David, to be the true son. The one who always does what the Father asks him to do. To have the blessing, to be the blessing. And it's so fitting that Jesus had to go to Egypt and be brought out. Because what God was doing in Jesus was the true and greater Exodus. I may preach through Exodus after Genesis, because we'll see. So we get to Luke chapter 9. Jesus goes to the gates of hell, and he picks a fight. He brings his disciples with him, and they go up on top of the mountain. And he's transfigured. I don't know what that looked like. I bet it was cool, though. The disciples are looking and going, oh, something just happened. And, so about 8 days after these saints took Peter and John and James, and he went up to the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, the two great deliverers. All right, so something's happening. Jesus is there, they're praying, and all of a sudden, the glory. And there's Moses, and there's Elijah, and I would have liked to heard that conversation. But this is what we get. And it said this, who appeared in glory, and they spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. So, Jesus goes up to a mountain to pray. Moses and Elijah, who, by the way, were dead, show up. And what do they talk about? They talk about his departure, which he's about to accomplish at Jerusalem. And you're like, that doesn't seem like the topic of conversation. Like, what does that mean? They spoke of his departure. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean much in English when we translate it, departure. Let me tell you what the word is in Greek. It says they spoke of his exodus, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Dude, I got goosebumps the first time I saw that. All of a sudden, it makes sense. In a complete way. What's Jesus doing when he goes to Jerusalem? What is Jesus doing when he goes to the cross? What is Jesus doing when he's buried in the tomb and rose again? He is accomplishing an exodus. He's accomplishing the exodus. The exodus that took place under Moses that led Israel's people out of Egypt was just a warm-up, was just a shadow of the exodus that the Messiah brings when he goes to the grave, and he doesn't conquer a human ruler. He conquers the spiritual powers and authorities. He defeats sin and death, and he rises to newness of life. Moses led them through the Red Sea. Jesus leads us through the sea of death. Right? So where is your sting, O grave? And where is your boast, O death? For Jesus descended into the depths of darkness, and the grave could not hold him. Jesus is the great deliverer. Jesus is the one that has conquered our greatest enemy. And Jesus is the one who will bring us home. Amen, and amen, and amen, and amen.